Oh hey, welcome back. It's time for another Angular tutorial. So in today's video, we're going to be building this lovely purple contact list. It allows us to dynamically add and remove up to 3 contacts and then submit. Now to achieve this, we're going to be learning about nesting reactive forms. We're going to be getting those forms to talk to each other from different components. We're also going to be using form control getters. And then we're going to be sprinkling just a little bit of form validation on for good luck. So open up your laptops, spin up your favorite text editor, and let's get writing some code. So before we get started, let's have a little look around our project. As always, there's a link to the GitHub repository down below in the description. Check that out and you can follow along with me. If we have a little look, I've got some markup in the template file here, and I've also already added all of the styles that we'll need for this project. Just because I don't want to focus too much on that, I want to look more at the actual business logic. If we jump into the TS file, you'll see there's absolutely nothing in here. This is just a default file that was created when I created the component. If we switch across to Chrome now, we can see that the form looks quite different to in a demo that I showed at the beginning. We've got errors always visible on screen. Our delete button is visible and also doesn't work. Also, the add another contact button is visible but also not working. So let's jump back to our project and let's have a little look at the markup. We've got this form element at the top. And then if we go down here, we've got a list with only one item in it at the moment. And that item is this contact form row that we can see here. And if I scroll down, it's only one item in this list. And then we've got the add another contact button and the submit button. Now, first things first, because we've got all of our form row logic here in this parent component, what I actually want to do is I want to take all of this, I want to cut it, and then we're going to create a child component in here. So I'm actually going to use the Angular CLI for this. So ng generate new component and then user contact. We can call this component whatever we want. I just like to make it clear that it's a child of this form. So if I run that, it will generate me a new component in here. And then we're going to go in here and we are going to paste the logic that we just cut from the parent form. If I save this, I need to neaten this up a little bit. I don't know why it's broken my indent in here. We save this, we switch across. We can now see that our form row is no longer in our parent form. That's all right. What we want to do is we want to jump back to our parent component. And before we forget, we want to add our component back in here. So that'll be app user contact. We save that, we switch back, and it's back in here. Now, the reason that we want to have this in a child component is we want to be able to dynamically add these. And so it's much cleaner just for us to chuck that in a child component. And rather than duplicate logic and markup, it's all neatly tucked away there. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to create our parent form. So if we go into our parent component, and then we'll create a new method in here. We're going to call that generate user contact form. It's going to take no parameters. Going to return nothing. Then we're going to call it in our ng init just to make sure that the form is created when the component is created. So we need to give this form a variable. So we're going to declare it up here and we're just going to call it user contact form, and that is of type form group. Sometimes people like to be implicit with their type declarations, but for me, I've always lent towards being explicit so that looking at my file, I know exactly what type everything is, and it leaves a little bit less guesswork for my text editor. So we want to declare in here our form. So we go user contact form equals, and then this is going to be a new form group. We pass an object into here. Then we need to add our contacts to here. And this is actually going to be a form array. The form array does exactly what it sounds like. It allows us to have an array of abstract controls, which can be a form control or a child form or whatever. Now, before we go any further, I want to allow us to be able to debug a little bit easier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a submit method. So if I go submit user contacts form, and all we're going to do in here is we are going to use the dreaded console log and log out our form. We could just as easily use the built-in JavaScript debugger or any debug tool, but for the purposes of this tutorial, I want to be able to hit submit on the form and see what the form actually contains. We're going to do .value here just so that we can see the actual values in the form and not just the form. Now let's jump back into our template file. What we want to do is we want to declare the form that we've just created in here. So if we go form group and we pass it the form that we've just created, and then I also want to add in that submit method we just created. So when the form is submitted, we call that method. Let's give ourselves a little line break under here. We save that, and if we jump back to here, when we hit submit, we get this little console logout, and it actually says that the array is empty. Now you might be asking yourself, how comes the array is empty? We've got a form row in here, but we actually haven't wired up this child component, we've just added it to the template. So the next thing we want to do, if we jump back to our project here, is we want to look at our child component, this user contact component that we just literally created. Now we're not going to use on a init, so we can remove that out of here. And because I just created this using the CLI, it's actually indented with spaces. Not a big fan of that. Now, first off, you might be thinking, hey, we need to create a method here that generates the child form in the same way that we generated the parent form. And I can't fault you for thinking that. But what we're going to do that's slightly different is we're going to create a method in here that creates the form that can be called in the parent component. There's a few different ways that you can do this, but the way that I like to do it is by creating a static method. Now, if you're not familiar with what static methods are, it's a method that can be called from any other component without actually having to have this component as a dependency. So I'm going to call this method add user contact, and then I'm going to say item. Now I quite like the word item. I feel like it implies that this is one in a list of many, but once again, you can call this method whatever you want. Now what we're going to be returning from this method is a form group. And as you can see, I get my little red underline, and that's because we're not returning anything yet. So if I go return new form group, we give it an object again, and then we need to tell it what fields are in this form. So if I look in the template file again, we can see that there's two fields. We've got a name field and we've got an email field. So if we jump back into here, so first off, we've got our name field. This is going to be a new form control. And at the moment, we're just going to pass it a blank string because we don't have any initial state for it. Then we comma a new line, and we want to go with our second field, which is an email field. Once again, it is a form control that we're adding, and we're giving it a blank string as its initial form state. So now that we have this static method, if we jump back to our parent component and we go down to here, we can actually call it. And we call it by using dot notation. So we go user contact component. This is the new child component we've just created. Then dot, and then add user contact item. Now, if we save this, we switch across to our page in Chrome. Now, if we hit the submit, and we look in here, we have indeed got one item inside our array, but things still aren't working how you'd expect. Because if I add my name in here and then I clear this and submit again, we open this up, it doesn't actually have my name in here. And this might be a little bit confusing, but the reason for this is because if we switch back to here and we look at our child component, we actually haven't created a form in here, which means that if we look in the template of our child component, we actually don't have a child form that all of these inputs are linked to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a form in here. We don't need this. I'm going to take my closing tag, tab all this in, and add my closing tag to the end. So this is now in a form. We need to create a form in our child component. Let's put that there to make it clearer. And so we go, we want a public variable so we can use this in the template file. And for now, I'm going to call this child form. Now, I want to make it clear that usually I wouldn't use naming conventions like child form or form, but because we're going to be jumping backs and forwards between the parent and the child component here quite quickly, I want it to be very clear what form we're dealing with and when. So this is of type form group. And we can now take the name child form. We can jump back into the template like we did in the parent form component. I'm going to add a new line here and I'm going to go square bracket form group and I'm going to make that equal child form. One other little thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to set autocomplete to off just so that when we're testing this form, it doesn't go through and try and pre-populate with my email address. Now, because we've declared our form here, it means that the inputs within here are assumed to be part of that form. And so all we have to do is we have to go form control name and we have to give it the same name that we used when we were declaring the form. Same thing here. This is the email input. We go form control name and we go email. This works in a similar way to how the name attribute would work with a normal HTML form. If we save this and we jump back to our form, we see that we've got ourselves a little console error. If I make that a bit bigger, what it's basically telling us is that we're trying to tell it that we've got form controls there, but our form actually hasn't been declared. And that's because in this child component, it hasn't. We've obviously declared the form fields in our template, but there's nothing in here that sets what this child form is. So this next step might seem a little bit higgledy-piggledy, but bear with me and it will make sense. What we're going to do is we're going to give this an input decorator. Make sure that was imported at the top. We can delete the on init because I removed that earlier on. Now what this allows us to do is to pass through the instance of this form from our parent component. And what I mean by that is if we jump across to our parent component, remember we've got this form array. Now if we call this static method twice, we're telling Angular that we want 2 of these child forms inside this form array. But if we look at our template, we've actually got this disconnect because there's nothing mapping this child component up with each of those child forms that we just created. So what we can do here is we can use an ng for loop and we can say let child form of, and then add our parent form in here. Then we want to tell it to get our contacts, which is our form array we were just looking at. And then we want to loop through the controls in there. Now we take that input that we just created, we go child form, and we pass it the child form that we just declared here. Now what this is saying is that we're going to loop through each of those and pass each one into our child form as this input. And then the template in this child component uses that child form to generate these inputs. So in short, if we jump across here, we now don't have a console error. And if I add some names here and then I submit and we look in here, we now have 2 items. The first one's name is Ryan and the second one's name is Tom. If I zoom in here, we can see that a lot clearer. Let's jump back to our code. Now this would be perfectly fine, but there's actually a little cleanup bit that I like to do. Because in our next steps, we're actually going to be accessing this contacts array a lot. Rather than keep using this get method, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here, I'm going to create a getter and I'm going to call it contacts array. So type form array, and then I'm going to tell it to return this dot user contact form dot get contacts, and then I'm going to use optional training, which is available in Angular 10, to null check this form. Now we still have this red underline, and it's because we're telling it we're returning a form array when really it's an abstract control. Now very rarely do I say that we should cast things, but in this case, so that IntelliSense gives us a lot more freedom, we're going to tell it that this abstract control is actually a form array. I'm actually going to change the name of this to contact array because I don't like to pluralize my variables. And then we're going to jump back into the template, and instead of doing this here, we're going to use our getter, and you'll see that Webstorm's no longer kicking up a fuss about this because it knows it's not an abstract control, it's actually a form array. We save this and we switch across, everything should still be fine. We fill in our names here, we submit, and this is still working. Now next up, we want to be able to allow the user to dynamically add another contact row. This is really, really simple. If we jump into the parent component again, we're going to add another method here, and we're going to call this one add user contact item. It's going to return nothing. Then all we're going to do is we're going to use our getter that we just created here. So we go this dot contact array. We're going to tell it to push, and then we're going to take our static method that we're using above here, and we're going to pass that in there. Now we need to call this method from our add another contact button that we've got in the template. So if we scroll down here, we're going to give this a click event, and we're going to call our new method from here. If I save this and then I switch across, we've only got 1 contact in here because we removed the second static method from where we generated our form. But now if we click this button, it adds new form rows. And once again, if we fill this in and we submit, the third item in this array should now have the name of Tom. Awesome. So now that we can add contacts, the next step we want to do is to be able to delete them. So if we jump across here and we find our delete button, it's actually in the child component at the bottom here. Now from this child component, if we look in the TS file here, we don't actually have access to the parent form. And so what we're going to need to do, similar to our input, we're going to need to use an output. We're going to call this delete contact event, and this is of type event emitter. So we'll import that. Now event emitter is a generic type, which means we need to tell it what type of value we are emitting. Now in our case, we need to delete something from an array, which means we need to know its index. So its index is going to be of type number, and we're going to make this a new event emitter. Now we need to create a method in here to actually fire that event emitter. We're going to call this method delete contact, and we're going to pass it an index. And we've already said that's a number. Now, all we want to do in here is we want to grab our event emitter, we want to next it, which means fire it with a value, and the value we're going to fire it with is our index. Now, because we've used this output decorator, it means that we can hook into this event wherever this component is called. So if we jump over to our parent component again, and we go to our for loop, underneath where we use our input, we can use our output here as well. But we need to tell it what to do when this event fires. So if we go into our parent TS file here, and we're going to create another method, this one's going to be called delete contact. Once again, we pass in an index, which is of type number. Remember, we're omitting that from the child component. Now, if we use our getter here, which remember gives us access to our contacts array, we can use a method that's built into Angular Reactive Forms arrays, and that is remove at, and then we just pass it our index. Now, on the off chance that this form doesn't exist when I try to remove an item from it, I'm going to use optional chaining. I better do that here again. In this case, it doesn't really matter because we know the form's always going to be there, but it's good practice. Now, if I take this method name and I pass it to our event, and then I tell it that it's got an event, this is our index that is being passed back from our event emitter. And let's not forget to go through to our child component, find the delete button, and call our delete contact method. Now we've got a little issue here. This method is expecting us to pass an index, which is completely correct. But our child component is what we call a dumb component. It doesn't really have any knowledge of anything outside itself. So what we need to do is we need to once again pass in a value. And this time it's array index. And this is going to be of type number. We want to add this to here. We then want to jump across to our parent component template, and we're going to need to pass in the index here. So it's array index, and there's a built-in way that we can get an index here. If we go up to the ng4 and we go let I equal index, and then here we just pass I in. We save this, we can jump across to here, and now when we add these, we can also remove them, which is awesome. And now that we know the index, we can make use of this title a little bit more. If we go back into the child component markup, we can change this. It's actually a typo. It should be contact, and then we want to use the array index +1 because we don't want contact 0, we want contact 1, 2, 3. Now if we jump across to here, it says contact 1, then contact 2, contact 3. I've just realized my styling is a bit strange there. Let's take a little look at why that is. It's because I've chucked my ng4 on the child component rather than on the list item. So if we save that and we jump across, should fix our styling a little bit here. There we go. Now we've got line dividers between each. Awesome. So next up, now that we've got our form adding and removing contacts, we want to add some logic that tells it when to show the add and remove buttons. Now, in my mind, you shouldn't be able to add another contact unless the contact information you've added is valid. So we need to add some validation to our form. If we jump back across to here, we go to our child component here, and we look at where we're generating our form. We don't currently have any validation at all. So if we add a new line here, want to add a comma on here, want to add an object, and then we can go validators. This takes an array, and for now the only validation I want to add is required. Now obviously in real life we'd probably want to validate to make sure that the email's in the right format and that we don't add too many characters and such, but for now I think this is going to do for our validation. And now that we have validation, if we jump through to our template, we can actually say that we only want these errors to show when that validation is triggered. So ng if, then we can go child form.get name.hasError, and the error will be just required. Once again, it's perfectly valid to do this, but I personally like to use getters. So if we cut this out here, we want to create ourselves a little getter, get name field, subtype form control, and then we want to return this. And once again, we cast it to tell it it's a form control. Now we know we're going to need the exact same thing for the email in a minute, so I'm going to go here and change this to email fields and email. Now if we jump back to our template, I can go name field. Then we can just copy this ng if and chuck it down here with this error as well. Obviously making sure to change this to email field. Now this is great, but if we jump across, you'll see that our errors are always visible until you type. I don't really like that. I only want the error to show up once the field is dirty. So we can jump back across here and we can make this a little bit more specific. So we can say name field also has to be dirty. Let's add that on a new line and let's do the same thing here. Email field has to be dirty. Coolio. Now if we switch back across to here and wait for it to refresh, now nothing shows up until I type in it, that's fine. And then when I remove, they know the field is now dirty. And so it shows the errors. And the same thing with the email field. It's now dirty, so it shows the error. Now that we have some validation, we can tell it to only show this button when this form is valid. Now, this is also really, really simple. If we jump into our parent component template and we go find our button, which is here, what we're going to use is we're going to use the disabled attribute. And we're going to tell it to be disabled if our contact array is not valid. It's as simple as that because that validity will bubble up to the top. So at the moment, this is disabled. The minute that I fill these out, it's no longer disabled. Now, on a similar note, this form is useless without any contacts. So I probably don't want to show this button unless there's more than one contact in the list. If we jump across to our components again, we're going to go to our child component. We're going to be passing in another value, and that's going to be total contacts. And that's a number. We're going to use that total contacts. We're going to go look for the delete button. And in this case, instead of disabling, I just want to hide it. So I'm going to go ng if, and I'll say if total contacts equals 1. Now we need to pass this in. So we go up to our parent level again. We're going to go total contacts here. And we're going to pass the child form array .length. I'm going to save that. We're going to jump back across to here. Our button's still visible. Let's have a look to see what we've done. Just as I thought. Let's actually change this to if it's more than one item, then we show the button. So currently there's only one item. If I fill these in and add another one, we now have delete buttons for both. But once again, once we remove one, we don't have the delete buttons anymore. Now at the moment, we can't add other contacts because currently the form is not valid, but we can still submit it. And there's no real use to submitting this form if the form is not valid. So because Reactive Forms has our back, we can actually do this really easily. If we jump back across to the parent component template, we scroll down to submit button. We want to use our disabled attribute again, and we want to say that when the contacts form is not valid, submit is disabled. If we switch back across to here, wait for this to refresh, and there you go, my submit button is disabled. When I fill in these fields, I can then submit. But when I add another contact, once again, it's not valid anymore and I can't submit. Now, as a final little step, in my form that I demoed at the beginning, you could only add a maximum number of 3 contacts. But you can see here that I can just add as many as I want. There's a couple of ways that we can fix this. What I could do is I could jump across to the parent form and we could use a validator on here and we could control it that way. But for me, I'm going to opt for a really, really simple way. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a span down here that basically says 3 is the maximum number of contacts you can add at this time. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an ngIf on here and say that if the contact array .length is less than 3, then we're going to show this button, else max contacts else. We're going to take this template variable name. I'm going to use ng template here. We're going to slot this inside and we're going to give it its template variable name. We save this and we jump back to here. We should now be able to add our 3 items. But once we've met our 3 items, we then get our message at the bottom. Maybe I'll add a little bit of styling just to make it look a little bit nicer. And with that, that's about everything that I wanted to cover today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. It really means a lot. If there was anything that I went over a bit too quickly or you just didn't understand, leave me a comment below and I'll get back to you within a day or so. Don't forget the repo is also in the description so you can check that out and follow along. And other than that, just take care of yourselves.